Atlantis-based computer log. I learned today that Jarmo Dvorak is still in Portugal, in a monastery owned by the ASTROCOHORS organization, which houses a massive library. Professor Yefimov suggested bringing Dvorak back to us from there, but instinctively I'm against it. I can't exactly explain it, but I have the impression that Dvorak is right where he is now. I await his reports and will decide at another time what orders he should receive. For the moment, after all, it is impossible for him to leave the planet. Too many questions remain as to where he's been all this time after setting off in search of the Temple of the Wind Harp.
Feel like growing old, 5 or 10 years. Well, let's do this. Hello, Anglophonians. Well, you might have heard about this prejudice that only boys read comics. Yeah, and this prejudice is not a singular event just for the United States or something, or the English-speaking nations. It was, well, present in Europe, in the Franco-Belgian area as well. Well, and today, why am I talking about this? We are looking at a new comic series. This series is called Sophie. Oh, a girl, you might say. Yes, but the problem is the editor didn't want to have a series with a girl as the main lead. And he said, oh no, girls don't read comics and boys won't like it when there is a girl as a lead. So the artist Jidéhem, who drew the comic, had to make a trick, and this is why today's episode is called a starter for Sophie, because we're not yet there that Sophie even appears in the comics. But yeah, it was some kind of starter, and incidentally, this series is also called Starter.
But before we do this, let's take a step back and look at where we really are. Belgium, officially Kingdom of Belgium, in Dutch Koninkrijk België, in French Royaume de Belgique, a federal state in Western Europe. It lies between the North Sea and the Ardennes and borders the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg and France. Within this series, we've already heard quite a bit about Belgium and its history, mostly related to the Tintin comics. For example, through Tintin in the Congo, we learned that this small country was once a colonial power. From the accounts of the Spirou comics, we know that Belgium was overrun by the Germans during World War II. Let's add a bit of information. Since independence in 1830 and constitution in 1831, Belgium has been a parliamentary hereditary monarchy. The north of the country with the Flemish is a Dutch language area, the south with the Walloons is a French language area. The Brussels capital region is officially bilingual, but the majority of residents are francophone. Hello, Francophonians! The Flemish-Walloon conflict, which has been going on since the 19th century, has shaped the often conflicting interests of the representatives of the two major population groups in Belgian politics. Language legislation is a consequence of this conflict. Since the 1970s, attempts have been made to counter this problem by decentralizing the organizations of the state. To this end, Belgium was transformed into a federal state consisting of 3 regions and 3 communities. Since then, the regions of Flanders, Wallonia and Brussels capital, as well as the Flemish, French and German-speaking communities, have formed the basic political structure of the country. The state structure of Belgium is considered to be complex. Oh, that's an understatement. For example, the territories of the regions do not coincide with those of the communities. For example, the competences of the French and Flemish communities overlap in the officially bilingual Brussels capital region, and the small area of the German-speaking community is part of the predominantly French-speaking Wallonia region. However, the German-speaking community is striving to be separated from Wallonia and raised to become the 4th Belgian region, with equal rights alongside Flanders, Wallonia and Brussels capital. Coming back to comics, these regions are the reason why many magazines have editions in 2 languages, one French and one Dutch. The magazine Spirou, for example, appears under this name only in French. The Dutch magazine was called Robbedoos. I hope that is the right pronunciation. Well, back to Brussels, where the publishing house Dupuis is based. It's 1950 and a character makes his debut in Spirou magazine that wasn't meant to be a part of comic adventures. Starter. He was the mascot of a series about cars, not comics, but reports. Just boy stuff. Boys are interested in cars, so there was a series of articles about cars. Starter was the fictional author of this series, who addressed the reader directly and presented the latest vehicles. The articles in of itself were written by the journalist Jacques Vauthier. But for the first 6 years, Starter was nothing more than a signature on the articles. It was not until 1956 that the idea of giving the figure a face came up. This Starter was drawn by the artist André Franquin, who had taken over the main series Spirou at the time. We will come back to this in our series on Spirou. For the moment, it should be said that Spirou really took off under Franquin in the 1950s, and the artist himself was, so to speak, the superstar of the magazine. This was also one of the reasons why the illustrations for the Starter series presented a problem for Franquin. He was overburdened with work anyway. Not only should he draw the character Starter, but he should also relate it to the topic of the article in question. For example, put Starter in the car that was just being presented. Drawings with technical devices, especially when details were important, were always very time-consuming. But at the time, Franquin had an assistant who helped him design the comics, a young man who drew under the alias Jidéhem. Born Jean de Messmaker, the young man found his alias along the way, as did Hergé. He took his initials JDM and transliterated them into French, Jidéhem. He was born in Brussels in December 1935 and was interested in comics from an early age. He began to redraw the adventures of Tintin as a child and then decided to go to the Saint-Luc Institute. Jidéhem was also heavily influenced by Maurice Tillieu and his Felix series. He then drew a detective series himself entitled Ginger, which was published in Heroic Albums magazine in 1954. At this point, he also adopted his pseudonym Jidéhem. The series was cancelled in 1956 and only continued 20 years later. After joining Dupuis, he was immediately assigned to André Franquin to help him. This was a stroke of luck, as it turned out, because Jidéhem had a special talent for drawing cars and all kinds of vehicles. He helped Franquin with many comics, for example Spirou or the new series Gaston, but also Starter. With Starter, Franquin gave Jidéhem free rein to adjust the image of the mechanic a bit. But Jidéhem also wanted to create something of his own. Franquin originally wanted him to take over the Gaston series, but that didn't happen. After all, Jidéhem collaborated on more than 500 Gaston gags. However, the publishing management of Dupuis did not want Jidéhem to do anything of his own. they were quite content that he was helping Franquin to get through the workload. Finally, there was a trade. If Jidéhem would continue to assist Franquin anyway, he could create his own story. The editor-in-chief Yvan Delporte came up with a special trick. He himself would write the scenario of the story. If the editor himself wrote the story, it would be hard to be refused. So Delporte wrote the first starter story, which was titled Revolt of the Cars. At the same time, the idea of creating a new comic series with a female protagonist, a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old, was floating around in Jidéhem's mind. But this was flatly rejected by the publishing director Dupuis. The rationale, as mentioned earlier, was that only boys would read comics and wouldn't be able to identify with a female protagonist. Today we know that this is double nonsense, but people weren't that far back then. Later, the Sophie series would be developed from Starter, but she didn't appear in the first few stories. But without Starter, there would be no Sophie series. So, what is the first comic story with the protagonist Starter about? First, it must be noted that this story was not released as a regular serial or comic book, but as a mini-book. We had that with Peyo's Smurfs too. Minibooks were a kind of extra supplement to Spirou magazine. The pages of the minibooks were printed onto a regular-sized page in a special way. The reader then had to fold these pages together, cut them in places and staple them together at the gutter. And the minibook was ready. The Revolt of the Cars story begins as cars begin to take on a life of their own. First, they don't do what the actual driver wants, and then there are even cars that simply drive away without any driver. Starter is a mechanic, so he thinks about what's behind all this. After a few wild chases, he can finally take a closer look at one of the cars and also finds the reason. Jidéhem later said about the resolution of this strange story,
"It was typical Delporte, totally insane, with microbes in the gearbox making the cars drive all by themselves."
To set the time frame, the story with Starter appeared as a minibook in Spirou on December 1959. And for some time, this story was to remain the only one. In June 1960, another minibook was published, albeit not a comic story, but an extended automobile article entitled The History of the Automobile. But how exactly the Sophie series, with the adventures of a little girl, should slowly develop from the stories about a mechanic, we will find out another time.
Well, there you have it. This was, so to speak, the start of a series that should turn out quite different in the end. But we will get to that. Until then, have nice people around you, stay safe and healthy. See you.